Cool. Well, thank you to Tori and Katie. All right, next up, going to welcome in Albert Thompson from Walton Isaacson, and we're going to talk about measurement because that's a lot of fun to talk about. Hey, Albert, how's it going?
I'm good, man. How are you doing?
Good. So I say that in jest, but measurement it also is kind of a fun topic to talk about if you're willing to like get in the weeds on it, because I feel like it's just fun talking about like challenges as opposed to making it seem like everything's great all the time. So,
Right.
I mean, on the measurement front, like obviously the GRP is still around. Let's kind of start there. Why are we still talking about the GRP in 2021? Why did the GRP, why has it survived the pandemic?
I think when you look at GRP, it was always the greatest currency for all things TV. And when people moved into connected TV, the first thing they said is, well, can we get an internet GRP? And it's like, yeah, it doesn't really work like that. And then you probably shouldn't be valuing it that way as well. So I think it's that a lot of people who are selling the scale of connected TV, VOD, FEP, or TV people. So in their mind, if this has credibility or efficacy, it needs to be measured the same way. It needs to have the same value proposition. And even for buyers who just didn't know, it was like, okay, well, that just makes sense. And it's a language that translates to the client. What they didn't start was a totally new narrative of how this form of content experience needs to be evaluated and assessed in a different lens and now has a new role in the ecosystem. So people just kept pushing it. It's almost to defend old territory. And I think what we've seen in media is that sometimes the most basic instinct of all instincts is just to defend instead of innovating and recreating. So it kept being flagged around, in which even when you put pre-roll video on a plan, clients were like, what is the internet correlated GRP with this? And it's like, that's not even the buying structure. But and sometimes to get it greenlit, you had to come up with a translation and a correlation to it, because that was just the only language that people could understood when you mentioned anything that had sight, sound, and motion tied to it. Anything video has to be tied to a GRP. And I it's kind of what we talked about on a forum earlier today, is like there's two worlds at work here. Someone who's still pushing the old model and others who realize that model has almost been obliterated.
And is that something that you're seeing change as we're seeing marketers or people inside of clients, companies inside of the brands who may have started out as the social media manager, or they were doing search, have now like moved up the ranks and now they're maybe VP of marketing, CMO level? Are they bringing that digital perspective with them?
I think there's enough information out there to know better. They just don't know the answer. And people don't want to make the pivot until the next concrete framework is highly defined. So the notion of moving with some degree of ambiguity kind of scares them, makes them uneasy. So look, they know that you can start to tie out business outcomes and commerce behaviors to other facets of video. They just don't know what that looks like yet. And then who may they be working with maybe hasn't sorted that out. So the comfort zone is, well, let's just stick with what we know, because it's a little messy and it's a little uncharted. Instead of being on a path of discovery and saying, hey, let's figure out the total, let's call it future of TV ecosystem: linear, VOD, FEP, connected TV, social video, pre-roll. How does it all work together? And what are the limitations of some of those channels and tactics? And what are the advantages of other ones? And how do some of them then help us teach what the other ones can't teach us? There's just not enough of that mindset, because there's so much protectionism around just buying, with TV being the halo, a very top-down approach to marketing versus a bottom-up, a lot more disruptive. And I think what it is clients are starting to discover, okay, there's a better way. No one's figured it out yet. But is there a comfort in leaving it behind to start to chart a new path? And that's really just a mixed bag. I mean, there are brands who believe that their brand is a TV brand, meaning the way they make inroads with the customer on the other end is through the lens of television. And then there are brands who just know TV is not it for us, or it's only a piece of it, or it serves a very defined role. And I think that's just the gap, in a sense that everyone is a bit of everywhere, but you either have people on the extreme side of having the precision in the audience targeting, and you have those in saying, hey, if we spend enough here, and we're moving the product, it must be working. And not assuming, well, maybe there are other things that work that are actually making this work, and not that particular, the particular cadence around linear TV buys. And I think that's what's created a bit of a midair stall, instead of people moving full-fledged into, let's really pick this apart. Let's start to dismantle the framework that built the business, that success, and start to understand what the new framework is to really build our future success. And that's just what I don't see. I don't hear the talk of saying we're now going to evolve because a new model and we need to discover it for our business.
And now we're kind of getting into that attribution conversation, which is really getting into the thick of things. That seems really tough because, like, obviously you don't really have last click attribution when it comes to TV or CTV. And so anytime you don't have last click, I mean, we saw this with, Facebook and others when it comes to view through attribution of everyone wants credit for the sale. And everyone wants to say that, hey, actually give me 50% credit. Like, the ad you ran on my platform was really good. And that was definitely, but it's unclear, like, what the rationale is with that. Where do things stand on the attribution front right now? Because now we have the TV screen coming in even more so as another device, another touch point, another place along the path to purchase.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing you have to look at is the dynamics of the different video screens at play between social video, between platforms like YouTube, the connected TV realm, where you can target people accessing via mobile device, but that's also different than running across VOD and full episode player that's largely non-clickable. And then obviously we know the dynamic of TV. Some of those user experiences don't have a second screen action, meaning people see it, they don't necessarily do anything. Okay, some of them do have a second screen action, and then some of them, the action is within the screen itself. Some of them have what I call a socialized action. So you start hearing the buzzwords around social TV as it's kind of being framed. You really have to look at each of those lanes and understand what the behaviors are to discern what you can attribute to their level of success. Again, there are tools out there that can measure each one of those lanes at some level. And one of the things I talked about on the forum earlier this morning is that, you have companies like TV Squared that can measure the impact of your TV rotation, connected TV as well, as it pertains to impact or lift related to search or people going to your actual brand site. So you need to layer that on to understand what the degree the video or TV ecosystem, in particular linear, drives that success factor for attribution. Then obviously from the connected TV standpoint, the capability is as advanced as mobile display was years ago. You can do all the audience targeting parameters. You can bolt on all the signals related to search, social, and commerce. And obviously if you're buying clickable inventory, then you can obviously track downstream to a site all the way through to the notion of a shopping cart. When you look at video across platforms like Instagram, TikTok, that stuff is highly socialized. A lot of people talk about it, a lot of comments, a lot of engagements. So you get into the notion of video content that has social as the second action, or the notion of just a conversation starter, essentially a catalyst. There's some degree of that exists with YouTube, or just the shareability of video that's on YouTube and some of the other video platforms. So that gets you down that different path of attribution. And then, when you start to look at the back end of just measurement of outcomes, obviously if you have some data governance philosophy that you're going to pixel tag placements and pixel tag some of the channels of media running around all things video, then you can start to learn to what degree does each channel move people down the funnel. Do some of the things stay at the top? Does some move them just from the top to the middle? Is it a full funnel that can move them all the way down, or does it really just sit at the bottom of the funnel? I mean, that's really how you start to unpack the role. I think what's happened is there's been this distraction around measurement. So you've seen the announcement in the partnership with Roku and Nielsen. Epsilon is now rolled out a people cloud. Then you have Nielsen One as a solution offering. So I'm not saying these aren't viable. And I'm not saying they don't have a place, because I think they're important in the ecosystem, but that's two conversations, having a view of the customer moving across all the channels. And then the attribution is what channels are doing what and what outcomes are you getting. But I think people are getting caught up in measurement to not point the face at attribution as a separate conversation or a business dynamic they need to understand. You essentially need to be looking at both. But the measurement movement seems to have stalled people in getting to the accountability of the different media types and what they can do for a business or for a level of brand exposure.
So, I mean, how do you reconcile those two? I mean, let's talk specifically about, you mentioned the TV squared example of, okay, I can know my linear spot ran at 8:20 p.m. And so I can see my search traffic, bumped up by X, percent from, 8:20 p.m. until 10 p.m. Oh, I'm probably going to credit that to my linear spot. In linear, that works great because we have a national ad load. Everyone's seeing the same ad in certain places. In streaming, things get super messy because I may be seeing the ad at 8:20 p.m. You may be seeing it at 8:20 a.m. or a whole different day. How does that kind of measurement get worked out when not everyone's seeing, when we have asynchronous viewing, when everything's on demand?
Yeah, great question. I would draw the analogy akin to print. So a print company would always tell you, well, here's our circulation. It's these numbers. But here's our newsstand pass along. Here's our newsstand number. And here's our pass along, meaning someone had read the magazine and gave it to a friend. So they'll say, hey, the overall circus, I'm making up 200,000, to households. And then our newsstand circulation in terms of buying behaviors, another 50,000. And then the pass along rate is another 25,000. So you may pay for 200, but the media value is 275. You'd have to look at it the same way and saying, okay, what's the impression value of a dedicated block where the majority of the viewership happens? But what is the long tail effect of people who consume content a year later? Because as you can see what's trending on Netflix, you got movies from the 90s and 80s, and you ask people oh, you never seen that? Like, everything's coming back. So half the consumer viewership base didn't even know it existed. Like, oh, this is new. This is the hot thing. Like, no, we actually invented that 20 years ago. It just came back. So yeah, you're on the level now. I mean, that is how you have to start looking at it in terms of that incremental media value, because viewership was then on demand at a later non-appointment part in time. Look, it's incumbent upon the platforms to sort of give you a value what that means as part of the formula. That's likely going to be value add to the equation, meaning you're not going to necessarily pay hard dollars for that. But when you start to think about that, you start to look at, okay, we will value the core block consumption at a certain amount of money, and that's what it's worth. Everything beyond that becomes gravy. The question is, are you measuring that? So let's get into what we call the look back window. The difference between linear and digital is linear doesn't really have a look back window. That's called reruns, okay? And reruns are pre-programmed and scheduled, right? Let's be clear. That's why you can watch Martin Lawrence from the 90s now every single day. Digital has a look back window where you have to understand what the behavior was when the campaign ended and when you stop spending the dollars. And we even do that from the store visit tracking, because we know that some people will show up at our clients' dealerships 30, 60 days later, not within the campaign window. So the look back window really matters in attribution. But that look back window, depending on the purchase pattern, could be 30 days, 60, 90. And it just depends on the platform how long they will allow you to go back. But you have to bring that all full circle and say, hey, the viewership in that core window was 100,000. But when you look at the look back window, we actually got to 1.5, which is why we charged you what we charged you, or you got an incremental 50% in media value over what your investment was because of the long tail that digital provides. And then a platform needs to say, now here are the outcomes of that. You got more site visits, more site traffic, more conversions. There's nothing more beautiful than a marketer than knowing the dollars you spent in the previous month are still earning you equity and sales in the following months. That's actually a critical conversation, because the follow-up months has loyalty, retention, renewal. That means the product is starting to stick. Those are the factors that clients are actually counting on. It's not the first sale, it's the third, fourth, fifth sale. So if partners would look at it like that, when you get into digital, they would actually be able to sell it as a strategic advantage, not just it's a freewheeling world. We don't know how to really rein it in, so we can't really tell you. But they need to start looking at the look back time in the long tail is where you get increased equity, media value, outcomes that you didn't pay for in your initial hard dollars. And that, I think that's part of what's missing in the narrative. But these are the things that we look for in a lot of the things we execute with partners, and saying, well, it's going to be available on demand, right? And for how long? We know the content consumption is for everyone who wasn't aware. That's their moment, not the moment when we were spending, quote unquote, the hard dollars during the campaign.
What's preventing them from, or what's the biggest roadblock you're running into in getting that look back from them?
I think part of it is, are their systems set up, their platform for tracking that? I think there is this notion of like TV, once it's gone, it's gone. Like once it's off the air, it's off the air. It's nothing you can do unless you want to buy the rights to it. And it's a mindset shift that in digital, it can live in infamy. So we would always ask partners, even when we do custom content that's always video, how long is it going to live over on your site? We want it there at least a year. Because I understand we're going to pay and tell the client success based on the 30-day campaign. But if it goes through the roof in the following 3 months, I want to go back to them and say, this thing just took off. Because the value proposition is, let's do it again. If it seemed like it was a one and done and that was all the value proposition, it's hard reselling it. And that's why you want to really play that up in terms of getting the renewal from a client or an advertiser sponsorship to say, this thing had a greater life, bigger than that. It's part of the reason you see everything going live now. You know, it used to be everything was just in person, but if you didn't go, you didn't even know existed. Now that things are live streamed, you can get an extended audience of people who couldn't see it in the flesh or during the appointment time. That's a huge additional value proposition in just extending the reach, which is what a client wants anyway. They want more people to essentially lay eyes on what they would focus on for their investment. And I think what the conversation is not happening is that incremental spillover effect of the opportunity for brand visibility or brand equity building that they really need to start to dialing up. Part of it on the platform side, it starts with, you need to be setting up the ecosystem of content and how you're housing it to have a life beyond. I don't care if a network says, hey, we're going to have it on our platform, and then it goes to our YouTube channel and it lives there forever. But on the network, we got to move it out of rotation to move in the next program we put in. But at least you know that the exponential views or content around it that involve your sponsorship and brand presence will live beyond elsewhere. I think that's just going to become an expectation in the norm. Like, yeah, okay, that's great. What happens after that? Because we're living in a world where I'm getting more return than just the core window of the sponsorship or program or rotation.
To what extent are you able to trust some of the measurements that you're getting these days? Like a lot's been made over the past month over Nielsen's measurement on the linear side of things, the VAB coming out and saying, y'all measured wrong, and then getting the MRC to say, actually, yeah, you kind of did in February. And then on the connected TV side of things, ACR, automated content recognition technology, basically technology that lets built into the TV set that lets a company be able to like either know what's appearing on the screen or hear what's playing off of the screen and take that into account in terms of, okay, what programs are people watching? What ads, were they shown? It has to be opted in because Vizio got slapped for having this technology without getting people's permissions ahead of time. But now we're seeing this technology be owned by companies who are also selling the ads. Roku just bought Nielsen's ACR tech. Vizio, as I mentioned, they have their ACR tech. They also have an advertising business that they've really stood up over the past year and a half, 2 years. To what extent? And then there's the Nielsen VAB stuff. Is there a trust issue here?
I think it's all experimental. It's all first gen. And that's the thing that made the GRP world so safe. It's like fifth gen. It's 60 years old plus maybe. So people have to understand it's experimental. It's not perfect. You need to take a directional mindset. And that directional mindset is it just needs to be good enough so we don't lose our shirt here, so that we're tracking the right direction in terms of the idea. So if you think about, we've done sync and target via connected TV, meaning we want to retarget people who have seen our competitors' ads. Well, my thing is, what's the response rate on a sync and target strategy? We found that it's actually not all that high. If you're playing at a massive scale, it makes sense. But if you're going after a micro segment, probably not so much. So it was less about, well, does this work? And more about, is it going to perform to move bigger outcomes? And if not, it's okay. We'll move on to the next thing. But we do at least need to experiment and essentially discern that. So when I look at, some of the other things, the ACR, some of the other measurements, like, okay, put them to the test. And look, the platforms need to be running pilots to discern, is it a thing? Like my biggest thing in all the innovations digital is let's figure out if it's a thing. And some of that's subjective just to the brand, to the category, to the product. It's nothing personal. So it's very different if you're selling Ruffles potato chips versus selling Louis Vuitton handbags. I mean, you just have to assume that every tactic won't work for your business. That's the whole point, to figure it out. I think when we get to 2025, 2030, where some of these technologies have matured to a decade, then you can start to get to the point of to which you can rely on them and they're rock solid. But I mean, I think in this era, highly experimental, you should, take it in the approach that they are. They're imperfect. Use them as directional insights, not the Bible, not to be so literal about it. And then I think you tread in a safe space of really understanding it for yourself. I mean, I think the brands always need to have diligence in discovering what's going to best serve their outcomes on their own accord, regardless of what a platform or a measurement company, a research firm, or a TV network is essentially selling you. I mean, look, they're in business to make money the best way they can based upon the things they put in front of you in terms of the opportunity, in terms of assurances. I would treat these technologies the same way I treat the brand health tracker. It is not 100% absolute as to what you sit, but it is a good barometer for what you are up against or what lies in front of you as the market opportunity. And the technologies really should be treated the same until you get to a point where there's just some definitiveness into the outcomes that they are telling you. And you can measure that back to internal business outcomes.
Got it. Okay. Best way to trust is to only trust so much. I think I'll get it, write that down somewhere. Before I let you go, we had David Cohen from IAB earlier mention how they're going to be surveying folks for how they may update their cancellation terms next year. And so I'm going to just ask everyone this. How do you want to see IAB update its cancellation terms?
I think there's just a dynamic nature of things way outside of an agency's control. I think 2020, everyone got a classic 101 in supply chain management, in a sense that if the product is not being made and is not available to retail, there's no reason to be spending money, at least to where you were. And definitely in certain channels, we saw clients turn off certain tactics just because the product wasn't there or wasn't there at scale, and didn't want a bad customer experience in which they're advertising something that's not available, which is not the premise in a great customer experience. So when you start to look at the cancellation options, there has to be some level of fluidity. COVID is now considered like a natural disaster. It's got to be part of the insurance policy, akin to anything else. So I mean, you see that provision written in. I think the adaptability and flexibility of digital, the ability to turn off, stop, start, pivot, has to move into other forms of media that were really guaranteed in 1-year contracts. And I get it. It's easy to project revenue when you've secured it for a year. But even with stadium sponsorship that we saw with some of our clients that either got put on pause or had to then renegotiate termination options in real time while money is essentially having been wasted. I think that was just a classic lesson of what couldn't be tolerated. And look, when CFOs have to step into the fore and say, okay, we got to rewrite the rules of engagement here and how we deal with partners in the space, we have to have greater adaptability of being able to get out and move in another direction, then the tides have completely changed. So I think what you're going to find is that fluidity and that new normal we had existed even in the back half of last year, that is going to be the norm, because maybe that's something that should have always been an option, i.e. not to be so locked into.
Got it. We're all living on balance boards these days. Albert, that's all the time we got, but this was a lot of fun. Appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely, man. Take care. Great chatting.